If there's divorce, there is conflict. The extent to which we handle the conflict in divorce depends on our ability to think clearly, be a little less emotional, but understand the tenets of conflict communication. We could not have a more perfect guest on our podcast today. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Debra Dupree. She is called the Mindset Doc. Dr. Dupree is a dispute resolution specialist, a conflict leadership coach, and international trainer and keynote speaker. I've known of Debra and gone to her seminars as part of the Southern California Mediation Association because she is well known in that field. With all of Debra's work in the corporate world, her company name is Relationships at Work, Debra wrote a book, and I want to talk about this book in relation to divorce and conflict/mediation, what we can do about it. The book is called Your Emotional Potential: How You Show Up Matters. Debra, first of all, welcome to the program, and can you please explain that key phrase, how you show up matters?
Well, thank you so much, Judith, for the opportunity to be on this podcast. In addition to my corporate work, I've worked extensively with families throughout the years in divorce. And that's actually how I got into, I started mediation before that, but became a very focal point, partly because I was going through my own divorce and found it very, very challenging. Yes. And, when we talk about how you show up matters, it's amazing the amount of communication that we do before we even utter a word. And so, how we show up matters. I define it in the sense of, so much of our communication, in fact, 55% of our communication is visual, what we see, the behavior of others, the look in their face, the look in their eye, the grimace, the grin, 55%. 38% is our tone, volume, and inflection. And so again, high tones, low tones, rough tones, demeaning tones, divisive tones. I mean, again, for example, I could go, oh, and that's a very simple word, but each time I said it, it conveyed a little different meaning. And then, 7%, it's not a large percentage, but 7% is related to the words. And so that small percentage doesn't mean the words are unimportant. I like to say, are we talking or are we communicating? Because it's one thing to say words, but it's another thing to really convey and communicate. But when we use inflammatory words, when we use foul language, when we use demeaning, derogatory terms or labels in our speech with other people, we basically have shot the whole wad of communication, because so how we show up matters. And our brains start reacting to someone's appearance, to how they sound, before we even begin to make sense of what's being said in our prefrontal cortex way up here. We're reacting all back here. And so that's where I, focus a lot in helping people build their emotional intelligence, which really centers on 4 key things: your own self-awareness, your self-management, other awareness, what clues, what signs, what do you pick up from other people, and then your relationship management. Now, what I know about myself and what I know about you, now how do I manage this relationship? So I try to educate people and help them grow into where they can have effective communications, constructive communications, not destructive communications. So I said a lot in response to your question.
No. This was all good. And so many points I want to pull out of what you just said. So let's just start with this. I know we can't get too technical. We don't have enough time, and I don't want to lose the audience, but what goes on in our brains, in our bodies matters. And so knowing that the words we speak, the tone of voice we use comes from the stasis of our bodies at any point in time. Is there an exercise or something you could give the audience to allow them to calm down quickly and gather their thoughts before they even speak?
Yes, I can. And I'd like to share with you, Judith, that, during our early COVID times, I took the opportunity to do all my live techniques and put them into short videos. So they're readily available for everyone. There are a couple things I'd like to share before I actually, give out the technique, okay? And first of all, is that when we get triggered, it's very easy to react, and that is in the emotional part of our brain. We have sort of three key areas, the automatic brain, which keeps our bodies functioning. We do have an emotional brain, and then we have the logical human brain. And so when we get triggered, we immediately have a neuronal, a brain chemistry, reaction going on. And if we stay in the heat of the moment, then that's where we are likely to say and do things that are hurtful, harmful, and damaging. And so that's one of the first steps then in developing our emotional intelligence, is realizing what are some of your triggers, for example, and then also what is your response? How quickly do you tend to be responsive? And instead, what we want to learn is to disengage from that heat of the moment. Take the time to do some deep breathing, pause, and actually re-engage in a calmer moment. And when we get triggered like this, depending upon the intensity or the severity of the trigger, it can actually take our bodies as much as 24 to 72 hours to physiologically settle down. And I see this all the time when I'm working with couples. Oh, we had this doozy of a fight, about 3 days ago. And the funny thing is we can't even remember what the fight was about anymore. We just remember how awful the experience was, and that's how our brains are impacted then. So when I talk about learning to disengage from the heat of the moment, first recognizing I'm triggered. And if I go there now, it's just going to get hotter and hotter. It's going to escalate even more. And then what's going to happen? We're both going to be very unhappy about this. So it is, in a way, sort of taking the higher road and say, you know what? I'm triggered right now. Let's agree to disengage and come back when we're both calmer. And so that's sort of the envelope there. But one of the first things that people can do, again, is recognizing where they triggered. Oftentimes it's a rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, that pit in the stomach, or maybe even a brain freeze. Those are the physiological manifestations of when we're triggered. Pay attention to that. That's information. That's valuable. That's gold information. And literally what we want to do is to create a pause, to take 3 or 4 deep breaths. Because not only does the deep breathing slow down your heart rate, expand your lungs, it also allows enough time for the brain signals to get from the reactive part back up into the cognitive part where we can be calmer. Now that takes some practice, but it's easy to do.
It's so funny because, I first heard about how important breathing is from Oprah. She used to do shows like that with people like Deepak Chopra and, well-known people in this field. And then as I got into mediation, that is what people talk about. Breathing is so much a part of the remedy of the excitement that we feel when we're fearful, when we're in flight syndrome, and when we're in conflict.
Absolutely. I like to say, we all breathe, but many times we're not breathing in a way that actually serves us well. And if both, let's say you and your partner, you have a conversation when you're not hot, and say, let's agree to sort of have a signal, a timeout, or, I'm triggered, and you honor that request to disengage from the heat of the moment. And then you both come back, because now you both have a chance to calm down. Okay, what is it about the situation that gets me so hot? And I was just working with a client yesterday who said, it's a tone of voice that the female in this dyad, uses that just sends him off, so he has a hard time managing his reaction. And so it's led to some angry outbursts. and gotten him into trouble. And we certainly see that kind of situation a lot in divorce cases too, of where I mean, divorce is hard enough. We're already deciding to end this relationship that used to be loving and warm and compassionate and so forth, and now we're so loathing and disgust or hate or whatever those feelings might be. It's really easy to be triggered, and so it is about self-care, but then also doing a little self-exploration in terms of where do I feel my triggers? How can I use that as road signs to when I need to take an exit, and what can I do to, soothe myself in the moment so that I don't become that crazy person that he or she keeps accusing me of being, because we get crazy making when we get triggered.
Yes, we do. And I am no different than anybody else when I get triggered. So in a divorce mediation, people are coming to mediation because they really want to work things out between them. But if they haven't gone through the emotional divorce, so these are my words, I talk about this concept I created called the recipe for a heart-healthy divorce. 4 ingredients. The very first one that I think is most important, and Dr. Dupree, I learned this from my own clients years ago. Go through the emotions of the divorce before you file for the divorce. Because if your emotions aren't settled, at least to a better extent than when you're just planning the divorce, you're not going to make sound legal decisions. You're not going to have clarity of mind, and you're not going to be without blame. And I saw this in a mediation one day where one person had not gone through the emotions, still was grieving, high level anger and blame. And maybe it was the other person's fault, but still, let's just say the other person is all to blame. You still have to calm down and be clear about what you're agreeing to. You can't just say, I don't care. Let him or her have what they want. I can't take this anymore. Show me the paper, I'll sign. That happens, right?
Absolutely.
Recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. Yes. There's another thing to say as far as, we talk about a no-fault divorce, but we know about the blame and shame that go on. And, it's so true. And this is true for any mediation, but particularly in divorce, because it is personal, it is emotional. Again, you fell in love and thought you had this wonderful relationship, and then whatever happened, and you no longer in the same space anymore. And what happens too then is that oftentimes one person has already been thinking about divorce long before the other person is even aware that the marriage is in trouble. Or somebody might say, well, I know we've been having challenges, but I never thought it was that bad to go to divorce. And so now you've got a shock factor in there, not just a hurt factor, but you've got a shock factor. And again, trauma. And so in that regard, it's important for the person initiating the divorce to also be mindful that the two of you are in different timelines, and to push the other person faster through the process, seldom works, because the emotional content is still so much there that, even though they may want to go through mediation to solve it, again, if we don't deal with those emotions, there will be difficulty in making good decisions. And we've seen it when people will give away way too much because they don't want to stay in the conflict anymore.
That's right. And then they so regret when the divorce is final, and you have distance, you have objectivity, you have a clearer mind. And then, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I did this. What can I do about it? Well, fortunately, in different states, they do have a period of time where you can go back and revisit if you meet certain qualifications. But best not to have to do that. So I'm so happy that you said what you just said, and that is, yes, there's the grieving stage, but the person who initiates the divorce talk has already gone through enough of the grieving stages to be able to say, I think we need to have a talk. I'm thinking about divorce. And so you're so perfect when you also mentioned now the other person needs to catch up emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And the initiator needs to understand they need their time and space too. So you have to just wait.
Mm-hmm.
Let them, and then go through the process. There was, I did, when I did some research to start presenting this workshop, the recipe for a heart healthy divorce, I did some research, and I came upon a quote from a judge, Judge Terry Crown. He's an appeals judge in Illinois. I love this quote. He said, "Without a doubt, whenever I get people in the courtroom arguing at trial, they always say it's about the velvet Elvis painting. It's never about the velvet Elvis painting. Everybody has a velvet Elvis painting at their homes. It's always about the hurt."
Mm-hmm.
Could you address the hurt that underlies how we behave in conflict?
That's a really important point to take a look at. Again, we're human beings, and we naturally seek relationships. We want to be accepted. We want, some of us have a stronger need to be included than others, and yet we still all thrive on human relationships. Now, the degree to which we need those human relationships will vary because we have different communication styles and our needs are different. That's where I see a lot of couples not having a good understanding of basic human behavior beyond, this other person I fell in love with, So we have a craving, we have a desire to be loved and to love back, to be cared for, to be accepted for who we are. And so when we start to experience an erosion of the relationship, then it feels very personal. It feels like my entire sense of self is being rejected by this other person. I'm being cast off, or maybe he or she has found somebody else, and now I'm being replaced. And so it's a whole lot of loss, and that's where we go back to the grieving process again. We're losing something that has been a big part of our life, and even when it's not necessarily the happiest, it's still something, that connectedness. And so struggling with just being alone. After the two parties have separated physically, that's a big adjustment right there. And then self-doubt: will I ever be lovable again, or will I ever love again? So all kinds of questions surface for people. And again, it's that hurt, losing something that we've had that is so very, very, or has been so very significant in our lives, and it just hurts.
And Dr. Dupree, so in a divorce mediation, trust is a result, or distrust is a result of the marriage changing, the relationship changing. In mediation, we do have to experience a level of trust, don't we? A, in the process of mediation, B, in the mediator guiding the process properly, but C, in the conversation that we're even going to have, the negotiation that we're even going to have. How does the spouse who's more insecure than the other spouse, ergo more emotional than the other spouse, how do they bring themselves forward to a point where they can engage well in mediation?
Well, I've given that kind of issue a lot of thought over the years. And what I have learned, and I'm not sure what your model is, but I really find it incredibly invaluable to engage people in pre-mediation. And that serves several purposes. One, it helps, it creates a confidential environment for myself as a mediator and each of the parties to get to know each other a little bit better, to establish some level of trust that they have with me as the mediator, so that they feel safe to go where we need to go and discussing difficult, challenging topics. But also by doing pre-mediation before bringing the parties together, you better understand some of the dynamics that have gone on between the couple. Like, has there been a higher, heavier hand, for example, by one of the spouses over the other? Has there been a pattern of succumbing behavior, passive behavior of giving in to the other party? And then also educating them about the mediation process. And I like to say, establish some rules of engagement so that people have an understanding about what's appropriate, what's not, and how you're going to redirect them when you see things going south on us, for example, that won't serve them or the mediation process well. So I use those pre-mediation sessions as an opportunity to do all of that one-on-one, and so I can address their concerns, but again, help create that safe, what I call psychologically safe environment with this other person that they no longer love and probably even hate at some point, and so that they can feel comfortable to go where we need to go. And when we come into joint session, then I go over the basics too. Now, both of you have heard this already from me, but I want to make sure that you're hearing it again from me together. And so again, I do a lot to create that environment so we can get to the place that we need to go. Because again, it's emotional. It's a loss. It's there can be a lack of trust that the other person has. And one of the things I like to do in pre-mediation too, somebody's always blaming somebody else. They say, well, it takes two to tango, and let's just think about what kinds of things have you done that maybe have helped contribute to the situation, and vice versa, just so that they're developing some self-awareness around that. And that's why I talk about your emotional potential in my book, is that, we, with some simple strategies, if we put them into place, we can actually practice, showing up more positively, more persuasively, more effectively, rather than, the past dynamics that, may have led to lots of arguing or things like that, blame and shame again. Because if they don't learn to step out of that dance that they've had, then they both go sliding down that slippery slope together. And once you're down in the muck, it's real hard to get out. It takes time to recover from that. And now we're just 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Okay, so love two things you said. The pre-mediation process. Now, we all talk to other mediators to see what their process is so we can pick up tips and make ourselves better. So one process that I've learned from a lot of mediators is they will spend a half an hour to an hour separately with each spouse, just letting them talk. They learn about them that way. But what I'm getting from you is you actually bring them together.
Yeah.
And that's so not to make decisions, but what do they do? And what do you all do again in the pre-mediation session?
Well, there are several steps I actually do. I will usually start off with a 30 or 45-minute session with each person to make introductions, to acquaint them with the process, and then and answer any questions for them. And where are they? Have they made any agreements so far that we need to be aware of, but we don't need to put into the negotiation mix? And so that's sort of the first thing. But then what I also do is particularly my background, but I do use 3 assessments that I usually have everybody go through, and it's called three steps to mindset shift. And so one does address emotional intelligence, one does address 4 communication styles, and the other one addresses the 5 communication conflict styles. And so for me, that helps deepen their understanding of self, but also where the other person is coming from. And by doing that, I have learned that not only is it educational and very valuable to people in making choices about how they show up differently, they also can, it gives them an opportunity to depersonalize some of the issues they have with the other person. Someone might say, well, Jamie is always like that. That's just who he is. So now we've just, enveloped this person and made the whole person bad. And it's hard to come out of that, when you're being attacked like that. But instead, if we look at the 4 communication styles, particularly, we can see that there are different focal points. There's even different ways of speaking, timing, responses to conflict, where they focus. We oftentimes hear the phrase, opposites attract, right? And so what I have found is that there are two particular communication styles that are very opposite, but they are very attracted to each other. And unless people learn to understand those differences and similarities, it's often those very differences that ends up breaking up the marriage, because they are so opposite. And so so by doing these assessments, I can then say, you know what, well, 75% of the population also share these characteristics, or, this is very typical of somebody who has this primary style. And so, so it's not just him, or it's not just her, right? And so it's a way of depersonalizing it and helping them look at the other person more objectively, so that they can. Yeah. So
I'm
thank
sorry
you.
to interrupt. I love what you just said.
It's valuable.
I can see that it is. Are you able to
Mhm.
say what the four communication styles are?
Yes, I'm certainly happy to. I actually have a fun little thing called the spice game. So I use spices, because after all, what makes food so good? It's the spices, right? And so
Yes.
what makes relationships so good? It's the combination of spices. And so the first one is a very directive, a take charge kind of communication style. The one who steps up to, what's the problem? What's the emergency? I'll take care of that. Very focused on getting things done quickly. And so that's more of the director or the commander. The next one is very similar but different, is the analyzer. And so both of those two styles are very task focused. Getting things done is what their concern is about. They're not so concerned about how you feeling today. So those two are thinkers. But the analyzer is different from the director, because as the word suggests, they're really good at analyzing details. They don't like conflict. They prefer to work alone. And not that they don't want relationships, but they a much smaller circle. And again, very analytical, almost, the point you've heard the phrase paralysis by analysis.
Yes.
Yeah, that sort of fits in there. Okay. Then the other two styles are similar in that they focus on the relationships. How are people doing? But then they're different again, because one is very expressive, and that's what it's called, influential, one who thrives around being with, around people and having lots of contacts and always checking with how you're doing and so forth, very active in the community and so forth. And then the other one, though, is very conflict avoidant, like the analyzer, but like small groups of people. They're the kind of person who would tend to have a few closer friends, like to work in small groups, really dislike large gatherings. Also are not real good about speaking or saying what's on their mind in the moment. They need time to process. Both the idea person and the analyzer need time to process things. They're not good when they get pushed in the moment, whereas the other two are very much more action oriented and get into it right away. And so where I tend to see the conflict in relationships, and you probably have heard these stories too, where we were up till 3 o'clock in the morning arguing, and I just wanted to go to bed, and she wouldn't stop, or he wouldn't stop. That's where we have the combination of the expressive person and the analyzer, is where we tend to see the most conflict. And this is true in the workplace as well as in marital relations and so forth.
The expressive person and the analyzer would typically be in communication conflict.
Yes.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
Because the expressive person wants to talk now, wants to deal with this now, and the analyzer can't. Just against their nature.
Yeah. And that goes back to, remember I talked about when we get triggered, we go up here. But that's why we want to learn to disengage from the heat of the moment and come back in a calmer moment. And I oftentimes say, especially when people are starting off, trying to practice this, give it 24 hours, because if you think about when you've had a difficult, fight or argument with somebody, you're hot and bothered, those first 24 hours were, but then the next day you start thinking about things differently. You're not quite so hot and bothered. You're starting to think about it a little bit more, and even up to 48 hours. And as I mentioned, 24 to 72 hours. And so we usually want to get it wrapped up though in about 3 days, because the idea person will try to drag it out. They never want to come back to the conflict. And so a lot of unresolved conflicts happen with that particular communication style. And so that's not good either, because what I've learned over the years is that kind of person is the one who tends to internalize, the conflict, and they oftentimes, quite honestly, maybe overweight, may have other health issues, gastrointestinal, heart issues, high blood pressure.
From holding it in.
Yeah, yes, yeah. So getting everybody to express. So I need to slow down my directors and my expressives, and I need to speed up my analyzers and my idea persons. And so that we can get into a circle of a dance of where we can have communication now.
I'm thinking all of this is great, but until you stop hating the other person, stop blaming the other person, so that you can function and get this divorce done properly, it's going to be a little bit of a mess. I think. So for everybody, this is a process, right? It's not linear. It's not, we just continue to move forward. We may take a couple steps forward and need to stop, or we may need to take a step back, reassess. I love your focus on gaining self-awareness, because it's so very important. It really is, not to put self-blame if it doesn't have to happen, but just an overall awareness of the history of the relationship. But something else that you mentioned in some of your key points for this book, and that is the way we attached in our families, what we learned from our parents' relationship, from our relationship with our parents. Does that not influence who we are and how we live and communicate with people?
Oh, absolutely. Because, we are so influenced in our growing up years by the dynamics of our own families, and particularly our parents. And so, depending upon the type of relationship our parents have, we may learn that that's how relationships function. And that's what we carry forward into our own adult lives. And so it's really important that we take a look at, again, not to find fault, but what worked and what didn't work, and using our more conscious cognitive brains to then say, I can now make choices. Just because this is how I was brought up doesn't mean this is how I have to live my life. I can make active choices to do things differently that are more productive, healthier, more satisfying for myself and my partner. I like to say, out of moments of pain comes the momentum for gain. Using those pain points and say, okay, I got to do something different. And what do I want to do, and how do I want to improve?
Yes, and this conflict can offer an excellent opportunity for change in a very, very positive way. Lastly, another point about the book and why it came into existence is, you talk about the psychology of conflict, and you did refer to that earlier in this interview, leads to the art of compassion. I mean, compassion in a divorce mediation may be a far off concept, but talk to me about compassion out of conflict or in conflict.
Yeah. I think many people have heard and would agree how important empathy is. We're not talking sympathy. We're talking about empathy. And the way I like to define it is, the ability to acknowledge somebody else's pain points or difficulties, even though you may not understand it, even though you may not have experienced it. Sympathy is more of, oh yeah, I've lost a brother, or I've been through a divorce. I've had that similar kind of experience. You can identify with them. But with empathy, it's really just about acknowledging what somebody is going through, or how they're impacted by something, even though you may not understand that. And I teach that a lot in my couples work as well as in my supervisors, managers work, because, well, I don't get that. Why are they so upset? But then one of the things that, as the neuroscience has continued to evolve, and I actually got this learning from the works of the Dalai Lama. He's really big on compassion, and so he calls it warm-heartedness. Okay, And that made all the difference for me when I first read that about 10 years ago. It's like, I mean, after all, who wants to be known or show up as cold-hearted? Not, we don't. So again,
Right.
it goes back to how we show up. Instead, coming from a place of warm-heartedness means not only in demonstrating empathy, but actually doing something to help alleviate their pain. That's where the art of compassion comes into play. Not just, Judith, I can see you're really upset. That's empathy. Compassion would be, how can I best support you right now? What do you need right now that I can help do in support of you? And so now you're building a linkage. You got my back. Oh my gosh, I may not like you, but you got my back. And so by teaching people a little bit more about the art of compassion, we can get through some of those difficult sticking points in a divorce mediation. Too
Yes,
often it's about fighting for what I want, and I don't care what you want, and I'm going to keep it from you just because you want it.
exactly. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong or right, I think that compassion can also come from understanding that your spouse's behavior can be in large measure a result of all they know from their familial relationships. And I do something now that a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist explained to me some years ago, and she was the one that said, oh no, we don't think we're going to repeat the behavior of our parents, but it's so ingrained in us that we do become our parents until somebody says, oh yeah, your mom or dad did that, and that's a good thing, or oh, your mom or dad did that, and that's not such a good thing, right? But when I say on the phone, when I get the initial phone calls in the office, we're getting divorced, and I ask the relevant questions. Are there kids? Do you own real estate? So I can just wrap my head around what I'm dealing with in the mediation. When it gets to a description of how their spouse communicates and behaves, my very next question is, did you get to know his or her family, parents especially, and how they behaved in the house? And all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. I don't have to say another thing. I don't have to be a therapist, which I'm not. All they have to do is see, wait a minute. Oh, I get it. Now, compassion. Now, can you look at this person a little differently, knowing that they are behaving in the way that they learn to behave? Do you find that as well?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so, you earlier asked me about, what's something someone can do when they're, triggered in the heat of the moment. I mentioned deep breathing. I do have an expanded version of that called the 4x6. And so it's actually practicing deep breathing 6 times a day for 4 deep breaths. And it's like a little mini internal massage of your heart and your gastrointestinal system, your brain, your lungs, and so forth. So that's something. But more specific to your point right now is I also engage people in what I call the 360-degree perspective. And, and this is again a play on words, if we're looking at the demise of this marriage, that's what we're looking at, the demise of this marriage. But do you and I see the same things in the demise of that marriage? No, because of who we are uniquely in our experiences, our familial backgrounds and things like that. We can look at it, we can look at the same thing, but we see very different things.
We interpret it differently.
Yeah. And so I have a video on that on my YouTube channel as well that takes people through that. And so I again, I do that in my family situations, even when I'm working with the kids, as well as in workplace situations. And people go, I never thought about that. Here we had this impression that we're looking at the same thing and we see the same thing. It's like, no. And that goes back to the communication styles, the conflict management styles, and, the whole emotional intelligence piece of it.
This is an excellent place, since we are now at the end of our time, and this went like 5 minutes for me. You've mentioned the YouTube videos. So what's your channel? And I have not yet mentioned that you actually have a podcast. So would you please mention that as well? I meant to do that.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Yes, like you, I host my own podcast called Decoding the Conflict Mindset. And so, because there's a lot to understand. And so I do have thought leaders from various walks of life, particularly around leadership, but also persons like yourself, because you were also a guest on my podcast about families and divorce.
Thank you.
And so yeah, so that comes out twice a month, and I encourage you to subscribe and listen to it. Decoding Conflict Mindset. So my YouTube channel is Dr. Dupree, and so they can find me there.
Excellent. I so appreciate you coming here. First of all, you're a legend. You're a little rock star, a
Thank
big
you.
rock star in the mediation field. So I feel very grateful that I got to meet you and that you're on the show. And I'm so thankful that I can share you with other people. So thank you so much. So in the show notes will be all of your contact information. And this book is wonderful. So I encourage people to get Your Emotional Potential, How You Show Up Matters. I think this is great. It doesn't matter whether it's for divorce or not. It's a great book to read.
Yeah. If I can add, Judith, just so people out there know, is that when they purchase on Amazon, the proceeds actually are donated to Kids Managing Conflict.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah. So because we're taking, through Southern California Mediation Association, we're taking, conflict management skills into schools and experiencing huge success. And so that's one of my projects I support and sponsor.
I did not know you were part of that program. So I know that you're on the board of Southern California Mediation Association, and I know of Kids Managing Conflict. That's great. That's wonderful. And kids are so interested in the whole issue of conflict because they have it in their lives.
Yes. Yes. And so, imagine if we all knew how to manage conflict better earlier.
Yeah.
And wouldn't our worlds be very, very different?
I would be different. Yes,
Yeah,
the world,
yeah.
and I would live my life. I would have lived a little bit differently. And when I get into those trigger situations, I would immediately know how to calm down. Because
Yes.
I mean, it happens to everybody. I don't care if we're mediators or not. We can get triggered too.
Absolutely. I mean, conflict is inevitable. It's not that we should eliminate conflict. Conflict in and of itself is not bad. It's how we manage or mismanage it is what are the devastating effects of it.
So well said. It's not that conflict is in our lives. That doesn't necessarily have to be devastating, but how we manage it creates the result. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Dupree. It was an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Judith. I just really, as you can see, I get excited and passionate about helping people navigate through conflict.
You certainly do, as do I. So thank all of you for listening. If you would like to propose a topic, you can do so through my website, theamicableddivorceexpert.com. It's on the episode page, I believe. SpeakerPipe, you can email me through that, or you can direct email me, Judith@theamicableddivorceexpert.com. And as always, have an amicable day.